When we think about World War I, we often picture soldiers in trenches. But some of the biggest battles weren't just soldier against soldier. They were fought against the environment itself, against the mud, the chaos, and the sheer impossibility of moving anything across a totally shattered landscape. So that's what we're going to dive into, how the forces of terrain and technology really defined the brutal logistics of the Great War.
Just take a look at this. I mean, this image says it all, doesn't it? This wasn't just a battlefield, it was a swamp. On the Western Front, the ground itself literally became a weapon, an enemy that could swallow men, machines, and all hope right along with them.
And, if you want to see the absolute worst of it, the ultimate example of this tyranny of the terrain, well, that brings us to the Third Battle of Ypres. You probably know it by the haunting name of its final objective, Passchendaele.
So the plan seemed simple enough. Break out of the Ypres salient, grab the high ground. But the reality? It was a total nightmare. Right as the offensive kicked off, the heaviest rains in 30 years began to fall. The whole battlefield, which was already just pulverized by artillery, dissolved into this sea of thick, deep, clinging mud. Shell craters filled up with water, and they became these deadly pools where wounded soldiers could, and very often did, just drown.
And the cost of fighting the mud, it's just staggering. After months of this horror, the British had nearly 250,000 casualties. And for what? For a gain of only a few miles of mud. It was just a brutal, brutal lesson in the limits of human endurance.
Okay, so Passchendaele was a disaster. But later that same year, the British decided to try something completely different. It was a huge gamble, not on manpower, but this time on the machine. This was the Battle of Cambrai.
This really lays it all out, doesn't it? Two totally different ideas about how to fight a war, just months apart. You've got Passchendaele, a slow, grinding meat grinder in the mud. And then you have Cambrai, the exact opposite, designed as this lightning-fast surprise attack on solid ground with a brand new weapon leading the charge.
So what was the big difference? What was the game changer? Well, it was one thing, the machine. It was a bet that technology could finally conquer the mud.
For the very first time, they were going to use tanks on a massive scale. See, the old way of doing things, a weeks-long artillery bombardment, just turned the ground into another muddy swamp. The plan at Cambrai was totally different. Hundreds of tanks would smash through the German wire and trenches in a sudden, shocking assault. The tank was supposed to be the answer to everything.
And you know what? At first, it worked like a dream. The breakthrough was absolutely stunning. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? The success didn't last. The Germans counterattacked and took back most of the ground. Why? Well, partly because the tanks were pretty unreliable back then and kept breaking down, and the infantry just couldn't keep up. So while it wasn't the big war-winning victory they'd hoped for, Cambrai was this huge light bulb moment. It proved that technology could break the bloody stalemate.
Okay, so we've talked about these grand strategies, right? Mud versus the machine. But let's zoom in a little bit, because underneath all of that, a much more fundamental war was being fought every single day. The logistical battle for simple survival.
I mean, really think about this for a second. Forget attacking the enemy. What happens when a soldier gets wounded in that hellscape, that sea of mud, craters, and barbed wire? How do you even begin to get them to safety? The logistics of it are just a nightmare.
Well, it was this perilous, multi-stage journey of just sheer desperation. It all started with the stretcher bearers, and these guys were unbelievably brave, carrying men out of the trenches, usually under fire. From there to a forward aid post, then onto a horse-drawn or motor ambulance if the roads weren't completely destroyed, and then eventually to a train or even a barge for the long haul to a base hospital way behind the lines.
This contrast right here tells the whole story. On one side, you have the absolute chaos of the front, where just staying alive was a minute-by-minute struggle. On the other, the clean, orderly world of a base hospital. The entire challenge, the whole system, was designed just to get a wounded soldier from that first world to the second, against all the odds. So, the whole thing, every single step, was just a race against the clock. Because any delay, a stuck ambulance, a shelled railway, a moment of confusion, meant a much higher risk of infection, shock, and ultimately death. Speed was literally life.
But when things get this desperate, people get incredibly creative. I mean, check this out. This is an underground hospital at RS. They dug it into old medieval tunnels right behind the front lines. It had 800 beds, an operating theater, even electricity and running water. Just an absolute marvel, designed to bring life-saving care as close to the chaos as humanly possible.
So, getting the wounded out was one huge logistical nightmare, but there was another one that was just as deadly.
and that was the crisis in communication. I mean, seriously, how do you command an army when you can't talk to it? Telephone lines were the main way they communicated, but they were constantly being blown to pieces by artillery. The backup plan? Send a person to run with a message, which was basically a suicide mission. And this breakdown meant attacks fell apart and, critically, medical units had no warning that hundreds of casualties were about to arrive, leaving them completely overwhelmed.
All right, so let's pull all this together. We've seen the mud of Passchendaele, the machines of Cambrai, and that desperate life-or-death struggle just to survive. So what does this pivotal year really teach us?
At the end of the day, it really boils down to this. The machine, the tank, it offered a glimpse of the future of warfare. But the brutal reality for the guys on the ground in 1917 was that the old enemies, the terrain, the weather, and the simple ability to get things where they needed to go, logistics, that's what still held the ultimate power over life and death.
You know, we throw that word logistics around all the time, but this is what it really means when the stakes are this high. It's not just moving boxes. It's the invisible nervous system of an entire army. And in World War I, winning this unseen war against chaos was often the battle that mattered most.
Which kind of leaves us with one last thought. Over a century later, with all our incredible technology, drones, satellites, you name it, how much of modern warfare still just boils down to this same fundamental contest? A battle against the mud and a reliance on the machine.